Japanese tourists respectfully bowed to both of the king's guards. The centuries-old structure stood like a silent sentinel, its stone walls weathered but majestic, the perfect blend of history and grandeur. For many of the tourists, it was a dream come true. They had heard stories about the place for years, and now, standing before it, they were filled with a mix of awe and reverence. As they walked through the grand archway leading into the palace courtyard, the hum of their voices softened. They knew they were entering a place that had witnessed countless historical moments, where royal figures had once stood, and where decisions that shaped the nation had been made. The stone path beneath their feet seemed to pulse with the weight of time itself. Their tour guide, a local who had spent many years sharing the palace's secrets with visitors, stood at the front. He was a man of few words, his serious demeanor only making the stories he told feel even more important. He spoke softly at first, as though trying not to disturb the silence of the place, but soon his voice grew stronger as he began to share the history of the palace and its significance. "This palace has stood for over 1,000 years," he said, his voice reverberating off the stone walls. "It has been the home of kings and queens, the stage for countless events that changed the course of history. And it is here that the royal guards stand watch, day in and day out, protecting the king and his legacy." The tourists listened intently, hanging on every word. The guide spoke of the royal family's traditions, the rituals that had been passed down from generation to generation. One of the most important traditions, he explained, was the role of the palace guards. These men, dressed in their ceremonial uniforms, were the symbols of the kingdom's strength and dignity. They stood in silence, unyielding and stoic, as they watched over the palace. For the tourists, hearing about the guards and their duty only heightened the feeling of reverence that the palace already inspired. The group stopped in front of the grand staircase leading up to the palace doors, their eyes drawn to the two guards standing at attention on either side. The guards were dressed in elaborate uniforms, complete with gleaming armor, their faces hidden behind ornate helmets. They stood perfectly still, like statues, their eyes fixed straight ahead. The tourists couldn't help but admire their composure. It was as if the guards had become a part of the palace itself, as ancient and enduring as the stones beneath their feet. The guide continued, his tone slightly more animated now. "The palace guards are not just protectors of the royal family," he said. "They are protectors of our culture and history. Their role goes far beyond the physical. They are the living embodiment of our nation's pride and resilience." As the guide spoke, the tourists exchanged glances, each of them absorbing the weight of what he was saying. The presence of the guards, so calm and resolute, seemed to bring the entire palace to life. The place felt different now, not just a historical site but a living, breathing testament to the kingdom's enduring legacy. Despite the significance of the moment, the tourists couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity. They had seen the guards from a distance, standing as unmoving as statues. Now that they were so close, they wondered what it would be like to stand where the guards stood. What did it take to remain so still, so focused, for hours on end? And how did the guards themselves feel, carrying such an important responsibility? One of the tourists, a woman named Hana, was particularly moved by the story. She had always been fascinated by traditions and rituals, and this visit to the palace felt like a step into a world where the old ways were still respected and upheld. She was struck by how the guards, despite being in the midst of such a bustling crowd of tourists, remained unflinching, their attention fixed entirely on their duty. As she looked closer at the guards, Hana noticed the intricate details of their uniforms. The gold embroidery on their coats, the polished helmets, and the perfectly aligned boots, everything about their appearance spoke of a deep commitment to their role. It was as if the guards had become a part of the palace itself, an unmovable part of history. She felt a surge of respect for them, not just for their physical presence, but for the tradition they represented. The tourists continued their walk through the courtyard, their steps slow and deliberate as they took in the surroundings. The grandeur of the palace was overwhelming, and it felt as though time itself had slowed down, allowing them to soak in every detail. The walls of the palace seemed to whisper secrets of the past, and for a brief moment, the tourists felt as though they were part of something far greater than themselves. As they approached the next stop on the tour, the guide paused and turned to face the group. "In Japan," he said, "we have a similar tradition. Our samurai were not just warriors, they were symbols of our honor and respect for the past. The bow, the act of showing respect, is an important part of our culture. It is a gesture that transcends words, a silent acknowledgement of the duty we owe to those who came before us." Hana felt a sense of connection to the guide's words. She thought of the samurai who had once served her country with honor, their stoic presence and unwavering commitment to their duty. It was a feeling she had always admired, and she was beginning to understand the deeper meaning of the guards' role in the palace. As the group moved on to the next area, the sounds of their footsteps filled the air, but for a moment, Hana remained behind. She looked back at the two guards, their figures still and resolute. She could sense the weight of their duty, the quiet pride they must have felt in their role. The guide noticed Hana lingering behind and walked over to her. "Is something on your mind?" he asked gently. Hana nodded, her eyes never leaving the guards. "I can't help but feel a deep respect for them," she said softly. "Their dedication to their duty is inspiring. It reminds me of the samurai in Japan. There's something about the way they stand, so still and focused, that makes me feel like I'm in the presence of something truly important." The guide smiled, his expression one of understanding. "It is that same respect that binds us across cultures," he said. "Traditions like these remind us of who we are and where we come from. They give us a sense of continuity, a reminder that even in a world that changes so quickly, there are things that remain constant." With that, Hana nodded, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment. As the group moved on, she knew that this visit would stay with her for a long time. The palace, the guards, and the traditions they represented had left an indelible mark on her heart. She would carry this moment with her, a reminder of the power of respect and the unspoken bonds that connect us all. As the tour continued, the group of Japanese tourists found themselves wandering deeper into the palace's grand hallways, their minds still lingering on the moment they had witnessed in the courtyard. Hana, in particular, couldn't shake the image of the palace guards, how they stood motionless, their eyes fixed on the horizon, seemingly unaware of the thousands of eyes that watched them every day. She felt something profound stir within her, something that connected her own culture to the one she was now surrounded by. In Japan, tradition was everything. Hana had grown up with stories of samurai warriors, disciplined and brave, who stood as guardians of the people. The concept of honor was ingrained in the very fabric of her life. It wasn't just about what one did, it was about how one did it, with grace, respect, and duty. Her grandfather, a man of old traditions, had always said, "The true measure of a person is not in what they accomplish, but in how they carry themselves through the world." Those words had stuck with her. As the tour moved on, Hana found herself discussing these thoughts with a few of the other tourists. She spoke softly, but with passion, about the similarities she saw between the palace guards and the samurai warriors of Japan. The others listened closely, nodding along, as if they too could sense the bond between the two cultures, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. "Do you think they understand us?" Hana asked her fellow traveler Eiko as they walked side by side. Eiko was a close friend, and the two had been inseparable since childhood. They had traveled together many times, but this trip felt different. This palace, with its ancient walls and regal atmosphere, seemed to speak a language of its own. Eiko, who had always been the more reserved of the two, paused and looked around, her eyes sweeping over the grand architecture. "I think they understand more than we realize," Eiko replied thoughtfully. "There is something about silence that connects people, no matter where they come from. Maybe it's not about speaking the same language, but about respecting the silence and what it represents." Hana nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Exactly. The guards don't need to say anything to show their strength. They stand, silent and still, like the samurai. And we understand what that silence means, don't we?" As they continued through the hallways, the group's guide, who had overheard their conversation, joined in. He explained that the idea of respect was deeply embedded in his country's history as well. He spoke of the ancient warriors who had once protected the kingdom, how they, too, had lived by the code of silence and duty. It wasn't just about guarding a place. It was about guarding a legacy, a tradition that stretched back through the centuries. The tourists were fascinated by the parallels between their own culture and the one they had encountered in the palace. They had come to see the beauty of the royal residence, but now they were discovering something deeper. They were experiencing a shared sense of reverence for the past, a respect for the traditions that had shaped the world they lived in. As they moved from room to room, the guide pointed out various relics and artifacts that told the story of the kingdom's history. The walls were lined with paintings depicting moments of triumph, but also of sorrow and sacrifice. Each artifact seemed to whisper a story of those who had lived before, and the tourists felt as though they were walking in the footsteps of those who had shaped the course of history. Hana found herself drawn to one particular painting. It depicted a samurai warrior, his armor gleaming in the sunlight as he stood in front of a great castle, sword in hand. The warrior's expression was solemn, his gaze distant, as though he were thinking of something far beyond the battlefield. The painting captured the essence of what it meant to serve with honor, to protect something greater than oneself. Hana stared at it for a long time, feeling a deep connection to the image. "I see something of ourselves in this," Hana said softly to Eiko, her voice barely above a whisper. Eiko looked at the painting and nodded. "It's as though the same spirit lives in both of us, even though we come from different lands." The guide, noticing their engagement with the painting, took a moment to explain its history. "This samurai," he began, "was known for his unwavering commitment to his people. He did not fight for personal glory, but for the honor of his country. His dedication to duty was what made him a legend." Hana felt a sense of pride swell in her chest. She had always admired the samurai for their discipline, their commitment to something greater than themselves. But now, standing in this palace and hearing the guide's words, she understood that this sense of duty was not limited to Japan. It was a universal value, one that transcended borders and cultures. As the group moved on, the guide's words lingered in Hana's mind. She thought about the guards outside, standing as silent sentinels, just like the samurai in the painting. They too were dedicated to something greater than themselves. Their role was not just to protect the palace, but to preserve the legacy of the kingdom, to ensure that its traditions would live on for future generations. The tourists began to talk among themselves, sharing their thoughts on what they had learned so far. The guide encouraged them to reflect on the similarities between the palace guards and the samurai warriors. He spoke of the deep respect both cultures had for their protectors and how, despite the passage of time, this respect remained a constant. "This is why we honor our guards," the guide said. "They are more than just soldiers. They are symbols of our nation's strength and resilience. They represent the unbroken chain of tradition, a link between the past and the present." Hana felt a deep sense of connection to the guide's words. As a Japanese citizen, she had always been proud of her country's traditions, but now, standing in a foreign land, she realized that those same values were respected across the world. The samurai might have been a symbol of her own culture, but the guards here in this foreign palace were no different. They too stood as symbols of honor, strength, and duty. As the group made their way to the final part of the tour, the feeling of connection between the two cultures remained in the air. The tourists had arrived as strangers in a foreign land, but now they were leaving with a deeper understanding of the shared values that united them. They had come to see the beauty of the palace, but they were leaving with something even more precious, a sense of respect, not just for the palace and its guards, but for the traditions that bound all people together. Hana looked back one last time at the palace guards, standing silently in their posts. She felt as though she understood them in a way she hadn't before. They were not just protectors of the palace. They were protectors of a culture, a legacy, and a tradition that reached across time and space. And in that moment, Hana knew that the respect she had for them would stay with her long after the tour had ended. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard. The group of Japanese tourists had toured the grand halls and chambers of the palace, each step drawing them deeper into the history and traditions that had shaped this place. But as they made their way back toward the main gates, their attention was drawn once again to the guards standing motionless at their posts. Hana, feeling the weight of the day's lessons and reflections, couldn't resist one final look at the two guards. She had been observing them for most of the afternoon, trying to understand the essence of their duty, their silent strength. They were the living embodiment of everything the palace stood for: honor, tradition, and the preservation of a legacy that stretched back for centuries. It was then that Hana had an idea. She had been thinking about her grandfather, who had often told her that respect was the most important thing one could offer to another person, no matter their background or position. Respect wasn't just a gesture, it was a way of life, a silent bond that connected people across time and space. Hana turned to Eiko, her closest friend. "Do you think we should show our respect to them?" she asked quietly, nodding toward the two guards who stood unmoving, their eyes fixed ahead. Eiko looked at the guards, her brow furrowed. "You mean, bow to them?" "Yes," Hana replied, her voice soft but firm. "We are in their presence, in a place that holds so much history and tradition. I think it's only right to acknowledge that with a gesture of respect." Eiko hesitated for a moment, glancing at the other members of the tour group, unsure if they would understand. But there was something in Hana's tone, a quiet certainty that made her heart swell with agreement. It was a small gesture, but sometimes the smallest actions carried the most meaning. With a nod of understanding, Eiko agreed. Together, they slowly approached the guards, the rest of the group following behind them. The air seemed to grow heavier as they drew closer, as though the very atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The tourists fell silent, their footsteps muffled against the stone courtyard. When they were a few paces away, Hana stopped and turned to face the guards. The rest of the group followed suit, forming a small line behind her. She could feel the weight of their collective gaze, their curiosity about what would happen next. But for Hana, there was only one thing on her mind: respect. She lowered her head in a deep bow, her hands at her sides, as was customary in her culture. It was a simple gesture, but it was filled with meaning. She was not bowing to the guards as individuals, but to the history they represented, to the honor they upheld, and to the traditions that had been passed down through generations. It was a gesture of gratitude, of recognition, and of reverence. Eiko followed suit, bowing beside her friend. And then, one by one, the rest of the group did the same. Each person lowered their head in silence, their movements deliberate and respectful. There was no need for words. The gesture spoke for itself. For a moment, the only sound in the courtyard was the soft rustling of the breeze as it passed through the trees. The tourists held their bow for a moment longer than they had expected, as though time itself had paused to acknowledge the significance of what was happening. The guards stood as they always did, unflinching, their faces hidden behind their helmets, but there was a palpable shift in the air, a sense of quiet acknowledgement. When the tourists finally straightened up, they found that the guards had not moved, but something had changed. The stillness between them seemed to carry more weight now, as though the moment had been shared, however silently. They had offered their respect, and in return they had received something even more valuable, a sense of connection, a shared understanding that went beyond words or gestures. The tour guide, who had been observing from a distance, walked over to the group with a soft smile on his face. "You've made a rare gesture today," he said quietly, his voice full of respect. "Most visitors don't think to do this." It is not common to see such a clear expression of respect for the guards. Hana felt a sense of quiet pride at the guide's words. It wasn't about being noticed, it was about doing what felt right. And in that moment, it felt right to bow, to acknowledge the silent strength of the guards, and to honor the legacy they protected. As the tourists began to move toward the next area of the tour, they exchanged looks of quiet satisfaction. There was a sense of peace in the group now, as though a shared moment of understanding had brought them closer together. Hana's heart swelled with gratitude, not just for the guards, but for the entire experience. She glanced back one last time at the palace gates, where the two guards stood, silent and watchful. Their role was not just to protect the palace, but to preserve something far more intangible, the very essence of the nation's identity. Hana realized that their duty was not just to stand in one place, but to stand for something much greater: the continuity of tradition, the reverence for history, and the quiet dignity of service. As the group continued their tour, Hana's thoughts drifted to the larger implications of what had just happened. She wondered how many people in the world truly understood the value of respect, how many were willing to offer it without expecting anything in return. She had always believed that respect was a bridge, a way to connect people across cultures, time, and distance. But today, she had witnessed that bridge firsthand, and it had taken her across a great distance, not just between countries, but between hearts. Eiko, walking beside her, smiled. "You were right," she said softly. "It felt important, not just for us, but for them too." Hana nodded. "It did, and I think it meant more than we'll ever know." As the day began to fade into evening, the tourists left the palace with a sense of fulfillment. They had come to see the beauty of the place, to explore its history, and to witness its grandeur. But in the end, it was the quiet moments, the moments of unexpected respect, that would stay with them long after they had returned home. The palace guards, who had stood so silently throughout the day, had unknowingly become part of a story that would live on in their hearts, a reminder of the power of respect and the bonds it created. As the tour continued, the group of Japanese tourists found themselves drawn deeper into the rich history of the palace. The guide, sensing their deepening engagement, led them to a quiet garden hidden within the palace walls. The lush greenery and the fragrance of blooming flowers filled the air, creating a sense of serenity that contrasted sharply with the bustling outside world. Hana walked slowly through the garden, her thoughts still lingering on the gesture of respect she and her friends had shared with the guards. She had never expected such a small action to carry so much weight. It had been a simple bow, a silent acknowledgement of the guards' duty and the traditions they upheld. Yet, it had created a connection, not just between her and the guards, but between the entire group and the history of the place. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. She had experienced something more than just a visit to a palace. She had participated in a moment of cultural exchange. Eiko, walking beside her, seemed equally thoughtful. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about how similar our cultures are. In Japan, we honor our warriors, the samurai, in much the same way. We bow to show respect not just to the person but to what they represent." Hana nodded, appreciating Eiko's words. "Yes, it's about more than just the individual. It's about the duty they carry, the traditions they protect. It's like the guards here. They don't just stand still, they are guardians of the past, preserving something much bigger than themselves." As they continued through the garden, they were joined by the rest of the tour group, who were similarly quiet and reflective. The air had shifted from one of mere curiosity to something deeper, a shared understanding of the importance of respect and tradition. The guide, who had been walking ahead, stopped and turned to address the group. His voice was softer now, as if the quiet of the garden had influenced him too. "I can see that you are all moved by what you have experienced today," he began. "You understand now that the palace is not just a collection of rooms and artifacts. It is a living testament to the values that have shaped this nation, values that are not unlike your own." The tourists, still processing their emotions, nodded in agreement. The guide continued, "This palace has stood for hundreds of years, and in that time it has witnessed countless moments of triumph and tragedy. But it has always remained steadfast in its purpose, to protect the legacy of the kingdom. And the guards, just like your samurai, are entrusted with that duty. They are not simply soldiers, they are the living embodiment of the kingdom's strength and honor." Hana felt a surge of pride at the guide's words. It was as though he had put into words exactly what she had been feeling. The palace, with its ancient walls and silent guards, was more than just a place of beauty. It was a symbol of continuity, a bridge between the past and the present. It was a place where traditions were not just remembered, but actively preserved. The tourists continued to walk through the garden, but Hana's mind was now fully occupied with the connections between her own culture and what she had seen at the palace. The bow she had made earlier had felt like a personal gesture, but now she realized it was something much bigger. It was a reflection of the universal respect that transcended borders and cultures, a respect for the duty and responsibility that came with guarding something precious. As they walked through the garden, the guide shared stories of the kingdom's history, each one more captivating than the last. He spoke of legendary kings and queens, of battles fought and won, and of the sacrifices made to ensure the survival of the kingdom. Hana listened intently, imagining the faces of the men and women who had once lived here, their lives shaped by the very traditions she had come to admire. The group paused near a small pond, where a statue of a royal figure stood in the center, surrounded by flowers. The guide pointed to the statue and explained, "This is the figure of the first king who established the palace. His vision was one of unity, strength, and respect for all people, regardless of their background. He understood that a nation's true power comes not from its wealth or its military might, but from the respect it shows its people and the traditions it upholds." Hana felt a deep connection to the king's vision. She thought of her own country, of the samurai who had once served with honor, and of the respect they had for the land they protected. The more she learned, the more she realized that respect was not just a cultural trait, it was a universal value, one that could unite people across time and space. As the group stood around the statue, a quiet moment passed, and Hana couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. The bond between their cultures, though not spoken aloud, had been forged in that moment of shared understanding. The guards, who had stood so silently in the courtyard, were not just symbols of one nation's strength. They were symbols of the strength of all people who upheld tradition and respect. The guide, sensing the change in the group, smiled softly. "I can see that you have all come to appreciate the deeper meaning of this place," he said. "The palace is not just a museum of the past. It is a living, breathing symbol of what we hold dear. And in many ways, it is your own traditions, your own sense of duty that have brought you here today." The tourists, now fully immersed in the experience, nodded, each one reflecting on the significance of what they had witnessed. Hana, in particular, felt a quiet sense of pride. She had always been proud of her country's traditions, but now she saw them reflected in another culture, another land, and she understood that these shared values were what made the world feel smaller, more connected. As the group made their way back toward the palace entrance, the guide stopped one last time and turned to them. What you experienced here today, the respect you showed the guards, is something that transcends time and place. It is a gesture that speaks to the heart of what it means to be human, to honor those who serve, to preserve traditions, and to uphold the values that connect us all. Hannah felt a deep sense of gratitude for the experience. She had come to the palace as a tourist, eager to see the beauty and history it held. But what she had gained was something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of the shared values that united all people, regardless of where they came from. The bond of respect that she had felt in the courtyard had spread throughout the entire group, uniting them in a way that words could never fully capture. As the tourists left the palace, they carried with them not just the memories of the places they had seen, but the quiet knowledge that respect, in all its forms, was the true bridge between cultures. It was a gift that would stay with them long after they had returned home, a reminder of the power of shared traditions and the quiet strength that comes from honoring the past. As the group of tourists made their way out of the palace, they were quieter than when they had entered. The excitement of sightseeing had been replaced by something deeper, a sense of reflection, a new understanding of the significance of the palace, the guards, and the traditions that had shaped the country they were visiting. Hannah, Aiko, and the others walked slowly, their steps unhurried, as if they didn't want to let go of the moment they had just shared. The sun had begun to set, casting a golden light over the palace walls. It was a beautiful sight, and yet it seemed to pale in comparison to the beauty of what they had experienced. The simple gesture of respect they had shown the guards earlier that day had sparked something much larger, a realization that respect, tradition, and duty were values that connected them not just to each other, but to the broader tapestry of human history. Hannah looked around at her fellow travelers. They were all lost in their thoughts, each one processing the experience in their own way. It had started as just another tourist attraction, but it had become so much more. They hadn't just visited a palace. They had connected with the very essence of what it meant to preserve a legacy, to honor those who came before, and to respect the traditions that had shaped the world they now lived in. As they walked down the path leading out of the palace, the guide who had been walking ahead of them turned to face the group. His expression was softer now, more thoughtful, as though he too had been moved by the day's events. "I can see that you have all experienced something meaningful today," he said, his voice carrying a quiet weight. "It is not often that visitors come to this palace and understand what it truly represents. You did more than just admire the beauty of the place, you connected with its spirit." The tourists nodded, each person reflecting on their own feelings. Hannah felt a sense of pride at the guide's words, but more than that, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They had come to the palace as strangers in a foreign land, but through their shared experience, they had become part of something much larger. The bond of respect they had formed, both among themselves and with the palace and its traditions, had created a connection that could never be undone. "We have not just visited a building," the guide continued, "but a living testament to the values of duty, honor, and respect. These are the things that hold us all together, no matter where we come from. The gesture you made earlier today, the bow to the guards, it wasn't just an act of respect for their role. It was a recognition of the very essence of what it means to serve something greater than oneself." Hannah felt the truth of the guide's words resonate deep within her. She thought of the samurai in Japan, of the warriors who had fought and died to protect their country and its traditions. And now, standing in this palace, she understood that the guards were doing the same thing, upholding a tradition, preserving a legacy, and standing in silent honor of those who had come before them. The group walked in silence for a moment, the weight of the guide's words settling in. As they passed through the gates of the palace, Hannah looked back one last time. The guards were still standing at their posts, silent and resolute, just as they had been when they first arrived. There was something deeply comforting in the sight of them, something that reminded her that, no matter how much the world changed, some things remained constant. The duty of the guards, the traditions they upheld, and the respect they commanded would endure long after the tourists had gone. Hana turned to Eiko, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think they will remember us?" she asked, her eyes following the guards. Eiko smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "I don't know," she said, "but I think they will remember what we did, not just because we bowed, but because we understood. We understood what they stand for." Hana nodded. The thought of the guards remembering their gesture brought her a sense of peace. It wasn't about recognition. It was about the shared understanding that had passed between them. She knew that the bow they had made was not just for the guards, it was for the palace, for the history it held, and for the traditions it preserved. It was a way of saying, "We see you, we honor you." As they left the palace grounds and made their way back to their hotel, the conversation in the group slowly shifted. The tourists began to talk more openly about their own traditions, their own cultures, and how similar they were to what they had just witnessed. The guide had opened their eyes to the universal values of respect and duty, and now they were eager to share their own stories. One woman who had been quiet throughout the tour spoke up. "In my country, we have a similar tradition," she said. "When we visit the elderly, we bow as a sign of respect. It's not just about showing honor to the person, it's about honoring the wisdom they've gained through their years. I've never really thought about it this way before, but I feel like what we did with the guards was the same. We bowed not just to them, but to the history and the traditions they carry." Others nodded in agreement, each one sharing their own experiences of respect and tradition. What had started as a small gesture had now blossomed into a conversation about the things that truly bind people together, values that were shared across cultures, regardless of geography or language. By the time the group returned to their hotel, the sense of unity among them was undeniable. They had come from different parts of the world, with different customs and ways of life, but the experience they had shared at the palace had created a bond that transcended all of that. They were no longer just a group of tourists. They were a group of people who had experienced something profound together, something that would stay with them long after the tour ended. Hana thought back to the bow she had made earlier in the day, and the quiet strength of the guards who had stood at attention. She realized that the guards would likely never know how much their silent presence had affected her and the others. But that was the beauty of it, they didn't need to know. The respect had been mutual, unspoken, and timeless. As Hana settled into her hotel room that night, she reflected on the day's events. The experience at the palace had been more than just a tour. It had been a lesson in understanding, in honoring tradition, and in the quiet power of respect. It had reminded her of the importance of acknowledging those who serve and protect, whether it be through silent gestures or through the honoring of their legacy. And as she drifted off to sleep, she knew that this experience would stay with her forever, shaping the way she saw the world and the people in it. It had shown her that no matter where we come from, no matter our differences, respect is the common thread that ties us all together, a thread that, once woven, never unravels.